Brett Favre, a Super Bowl champion, 3 consecutive MVPs, 20 years of relentless durability, never leaving the field. A living legend of American football who redefined what toughness means in the NFL. From those reckless throws in the blizzards of Lambeau Field to the escapes from sacks in moments when it seemed impossible to get back up, he conquered the harshest stadiums on the planet with audacity, instinct, and an iron will that never accepted leaving the game. Millions admired him as the symbol of courage and the unyielding spirit, but behind those roaring cheers is a story not glamorous but harsh. A boy raised under the steel discipline of a coach father, where tears were not allowed to fall. The years of being doubted, dismissed, nearly cut from the league before he could prove himself. The silent battle with alcohol and painkillers, just as his career hit its peak. The night his father died and he still stepped onto the field to throw 4 touchdowns as if his heart hadn't shattered. The hospital room where he first understood that some battles can't be won with sheer will, and then the repeated collisions, hundreds of times his body hitting the ground, dozens of times his head spinning, but he never left the field. Now at 56, when the cheers have faded, and the helmet is just a keepsake in a glass case, when some mornings memories come slower and the silences stretch longer than usual, what is really happening to Brett Favre in the darkness behind the legend and the collisions that won't go away? If the story of this hero who never left the field makes you think, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the tumultuous journey behind that helmet. Before becoming the hero who never left the field, Brett Favre was just a boy growing up in Kiln, Mississippi, a small town where there wasn't much besides pine forests, red dirt roads and the high school football field as the community's only pride. There summers burned like fire, winters crept cold and damp into the bones, and kids were taught that if you fall, you get up yourself before anyone can see. Mississippi wasn't a place for softness, and in the Favre household, that was truer than ever. His father, Irvin Favre, was the football coach at Hancock North Central High School. He wasn't a man of long hugs or gentle encouragement. He believed character was forged through discipline, and discipline through contact. To Irvin, football wasn't just a game. It was a test of manhood. It was where his son had to learn to take pain without complaint, to stand up even when his knees trembled. Brett grew up to the sound of the practice whistle, the smell of wet grass and mud, in afternoons where his father watched every step with a cold stare, not from lack of love, but because he believed love meant preparing his son for a brutal world. When Brett got hit hard and stayed down a few seconds longer than usual, his father didn't run out. He just stood there, arms crossed. The message was clear: if you're still breathing, get up yourself. In Kiln, men didn't talk about fear. They didn't talk about headaches after a hit. They didn't talk about sleepless nights. They talked about winning, about playing all 4 quarters. And Brett learned fast. He learned to swallow tears before they could spill, learned to nod when his shoulder burned, learned to smile when all he wanted was to sit down. Some evenings after everyone was asleep, Brett sat quietly in his small room, staring at hands still trembling slightly from that day's game. He didn't know if it was fatigue or something else, but he knew one thing: tomorrow his dad would blow the whistle again, and he'd have to go back out like nothing happened. As a teenager, Brett wasn't just playing ball, he was trying to prove he was worthy of his father's gaze. Irvin Favre loved his son, but his love was wrapped in steel. He believed if Brett could survive those brutal practices, he could survive anything out there. And in a town where opportunities were as rare as rain in drought season, football was the only ticket out of Kiln's borders. Irvin knew it, Brett knew it too. But the price of that ticket was relentless toughness. In high school, Brett wasn't a quarterback in a flashy passing system. His father demanded he run, crash into contact, take hits like a running back. Every time he got knocked down, he heard his father's voice in his head: get up. No second option, no room for weakness. He learned to turn pain into fuel, ragged breaths into resolve. But beneath that shell was still a boy who sometimes wanted to hear he'd done well, wanted a pat on the back after a game, wanted to be told pain was normal. Instead, Brett got short nods, reminders that he could always do better. So he kept pushing himself farther, running faster, throwing harder, enduring more. No one in Kiln called it tragedy, they called it raising a son right, but it was in those years that something crucial took shape. Brett Favre didn't just learn to play, he learned to endure, learned to hide injury, learned to treat pain as a private matter, not to be shared. When the first hits made his head spin, he didn't say anything. When his shoulder ached all night, he didn't complain. The culture there taught that pain was just an excuse for the weak, and so that boy grew up with an instinct that would follow him his whole life. If you can stand, you must stand. If you can throw, you must throw. If you can play, you never leave the field. Toughness was no longer a choice. It became reflex. It became armor against the world. Many years later, when all of America praised his streak of 297 consecutive games, few understood that streak didn't start in Green Bay. It started on a high school field in Mississippi, under the stern gaze of a father who believed his son had only one path, stronger than yesterday. Brett Favre wasn't allowed to be weak, and gradually, he stopped allowing himself to be weak too. In 1991, the name Brett Favre was finally called in the NFL draft, not first round, not the bright lights of top picks. He was selected in the second round by the Atlanta Falcons, a chance but not full trust. For the boy from Mississippi, it should have been the start of the dream, but reality felt more like a warning than a welcome. In Atlanta, Favre wasn't seen as a raw gem. He was seen as a gamble. The head coach at the time, Jerry Glanville, didn't hide his skepticism. He straight up said Favre wasn't the kind of quarterback he wanted. Too cocky, too reckless, too trusting in his arm. The throws that wowed crowds in college became proof of lack of control in the eyes of the coaching staff. That first training camp wasn't a place to shine, it was a place to survive. Favre struggled with a complex system, with a game speed faster than anything he'd ever experienced. Every mistake was magnified. Every off-target throw was remembered. He was no longer the boy his father trusted with the ball every Friday night. He was just a rookie, trying not to get cut from the roster. In his rookie season, he threw the ball only 4 times. 4. And one of those was an interception. The doubters felt vindicated. There were rumors that the coaching staff didn't believe he had enough discipline to become a real NFL quarterback. There were days Favre stood on the sideline, helmet on, knowing he wouldn't be called. That feeling hurt worse than any tackle. The boy who'd been taught that if you can still stand you have to play, now had to learn a different lesson. Sometimes you stand there but no one wants to hand you the ball, and in that silence, doubt began to creep in. Were they right? Was he just too reckless to survive in this league? Just 1 year after being drafted, the unthinkable happened. Atlanta decided to trade him. Favre, who once dreamed of being the cornerstone of an NFL team, was shipped off like an ill-fitting contract. When the news broke, no one called it a tragedy. They called it business. But for Favre, it was a blow to his pride. The legend nearly died in the cradle. He hadn't proven anything yet, hadn't fixed the mistakes, hadn't found his footing, and he was already labeled a failed experiment. Some players never recover from a start like that, tagged not good enough before they even mature. When he left Atlanta for the Green Bay Packers in 1992, it wasn't the journey of a rising star, it was the journey of a player trying to hold on to his dream. The Packers weren't paradise either. They were a team searching for hope amid years of disappointment. 2 undervalued entities met at the same fragile moment. But in that moment of rejection, something happened. Instead of breaking, Brett Favre got tougher. The criticism about his recklessness didn't make him cautious. It only made him more determined to prove that his boldness wasn't a weakness, it was his essence. Many years later, when all of America called him one of the greatest quarterbacks in history, few remembered that he was once seen as uncontrollable. Few remembered that his career nearly ended before it truly began. But those months of doubt forged an extra layer of armor in him. A man who'd learned not to cry when knocked down now learned a new lesson. No one hands you glory. You have to take it. And when the plane touched down in Green Bay, amid the bone-chilling cold of Wisconsin, Brett Favre didn't bring fame. He brought one thing: the pain of being discarded. And sometimes, that pain is the most powerful fuel. When the plane landed in Wisconsin in 1992, Brett Favre didn't step into an empire. He stepped into a lost team. The Green Bay Packers weren't the glorious symbol of history back then. They were a group that had just endured many disappointing seasons. Lambeau stands still packed, but faith was fragile. This small city lived and breathed football, and the pain of failure was as thick as the snow blanketing the field every winter. Favre wasn't welcomed as a savior. He was a discarded quarterback from Atlanta, another gamble on a long list of experiments. But the opportunity in Green Bay came faster than he expected. When Don Majkowski got injured in an early season game, Favre's name was called. Not much prep time, no big speech, just cheers mixed with doubt. His first throw with the Packers was picked off. A brutal start. But then what the rest of America would later come to know appeared: fearless recklessness. Favre threw again, harder, farther. He didn't play it safe. He played to win every yard like it was his last touch, and when he led the Packers to a comeback against the Cincinnati Bengals that day, something changed. Not just on the scoreboard, but in his teammates' eyes. Green Bay found hope, and Favre found his stage. Lambeau Field in winter wasn't for the hesitant. Wind off Lake Michigan cut through layers, snow covered every yard line, breath steamed after every snap. There you couldn't fake toughness, you had to be tough. And Favre seemed born for that place. He smiled when knocked down. He slapped his helmet after touchdowns. He played like a kid in the backyard, but in the body of a man ready to collide with anyone. His style gave coaches heart attacks and fans delirium. Throws threading through 3 defenders, scrambles defying danger. He was the gunslinger ready to risk it all for one great moment. But behind those bold throws were hits no one counted. Every sack, his body slammed onto frozen turf hard as concrete. Every blindside hit from a linebacker, his head rattled inside the helmet. Those early years in Green Bay were a chain of highs and wear. He began the streak of consecutive starts that later became legendary. But that legend wasn't built on miracles. It was built on bruises and mornings when his body felt locked up. There were games he threw with swollen fingers. Days his shoulder hurt so much he couldn't lift his arm high to dress. But he didn't say anything. The culture from Mississippi followed him to Wisconsin. Pain isn't spoken. If you can stand, you play. Teammates saw that grit and were inspired. But few saw the nights he lay still, staring at the hotel ceiling, feeling his heartbeat pounding in his head after a too hard hit. Green Bay started winning more. In the 1990s, the Packers went from a struggling team to a legitimate contender. And Favre became the center of that revival. Every victory reinforced his image as a symbol of durability, but at the same time, every game was quietly accumulating something else. The human body has limits. The brain doesn't forget those shakes. But in that era, no one talked much about concussions. They called it getting dinged, sat him out for a few minutes, then sent him back in. Favre usually came back. He always came back. And every time, the crowd stood up and cheered. They loved how he refused to leave the field. They loved the image of the man knocked down and springing right back up. But that very moment, the moment he stood up when he should have rested, became the foundation for the price he'd pay later. When the Lambeau lights reflected off the white snow, he looked invincible. But no one is invincible against physics. No one can take hundreds of hits without leaving scars. Green Bay in the snow gave Brett Favre a second chance, and he grabbed it with both hands. He put the Packers back on the NFL map. He reignited the faith of a small city that lived for football. But at the same time, he also began giving away the most precious thing he had, his body. Every throw, every fall, every time he got back up, wasn't just a heroic moment. It was a debt quietly building. When all of America started calling him unbeatable, Brett Favre kept stepping onto the field in blizzards, kept smiling after every collision. He didn't know, or didn't want to know, that his body was enduring things no one could see. And amid the howling wind through the Lambeau stands, a legend was being born. But the price of that legend was also starting to be recorded, one hit at a time. Green Bay gave him a second chance, but at the same time, another battle began, one with no spectators, no scoreboard, no end of quarter whistle. Brett Favre was becoming the icon of toughness on the field, but off the grass, he was slipping into a darkness few could see. The pressure in the NFL didn't just come from defenders crashing into you, it came from the expectations of an entire city. From having to prove every week that you deserved the spot. From the fear that one day you'd be replaced, just like in Atlanta. Favre carried inside him the instinct that he was never allowed to be weak. But the human body and mind aren't designed to live forever in a state of combat. Alcohol at first was just a way to blow off steam, a few drinks after the game, a few long nights with teammates. But gradually, the line between relief and dependence blurred. When his shoulder ached, when his head buzzed after hits, when pressure wouldn't let him sleep, alcohol became what quieted the noise in his head. Then came the painkillers. The NFL is a league of bruises hidden under tape. Players play through injuries every week. Favre was no exception. The pills were handed to him like part of the routine. They helped him throw when his shoulder was torn, helped him stand when his back stabbed with pain. But those pills didn't just numb physical pain. They blurred sensation. They blurred the line between clear and hazy. There were games he stepped onto the field with his mind covered in a thin fog. His arm was still strong, his reflexes still sharp, but inside, he wasn't fully there. And that was more dangerous than any tackle. People saw perfect spirals, spectacular comebacks. They didn't see the nights he woke in the dark, heart racing, cold sweat on his forehead. Deanna saw it. Deanna Favre didn't love a legend. She loved the boy from Mississippi, who once trembled with fear of failure but still smiled. She saw the change in his eyes, the unprovoked irritability, the exhaustion that didn't just come from the field, the silences at dinner, the nights he came home but seemed still somewhere far away. In 1996, when his career was reaching its peak, when the Packers were closer than ever to the Super Bowl dream, Favre's secret battle could no longer be hidden. News of his painkiller abuse leaked out. The image of the tough hero began to crack. But the most painful thing wasn't the headlines. It was his wife's gaze. He nearly lost her. For a man raised to never show weakness, admitting he was out of control was almost impossible. But sometimes real strength isn't in fighting alone. It's in accepting you can't save yourself. Favre entered rehab in 1996, not as an MVP, not as an NFL star, but as a man terrified of himself. Those first days in treatment had no cheers, no stadium lights, just silence, just raw conversations where he had to look at himself, had to admit that the toughness he'd carried his whole life wasn't enough against everything. He'd taken hits from the biggest defenders in the league, but he couldn't keep fighting the internal war forever. When he returned to Green Bay, many only saw a quarterback ready for a new season. They didn't see the man who just survived one of the hardest battles of his life. The 1996 season ended with a Super Bowl XXX championship. All of America praised him as a symbol of comeback. But few understood that victory wasn't just about football. It was a victory over himself. And then the question started to echo, even if no one said it out loud. How many hits were on the field? How many were inside? Every tackle hurt his body. But every night of drinking cracked his mind. Every pill let him play one more week. But it also took away a piece of his clarity. When the crowd chanted Brett Favre's name, they chanted for his courage. But they didn't know the greatest courage might be walking into a room with no audience and saying, "I need help." Brett Favre's first tragedy wasn't failure on the scoreboard. It was the risk of losing himself while the whole world believed he was unbeatable. But instead of letting the darkness swallow him, he chose to face it. And in that silent battle, another side of the man took shape. Not just the guy who never left the field, but the man brave enough to admit he'd fallen. In the years that followed, when people talked about the streak of 297 consecutive games, about the throws in Lambeau's white snow, they might forget how 1996 truly saved him. But for Favre, it was a milestone that never faded. He understood that durability isn't just standing up to outside hits, it's standing up to the storm inside. And from then on, every time he stepped onto the field, it wasn't just to prove he was tough. It was also to remind himself that he'd survived a war no one saw. In January of 1997, the world saw a dazzling peak, Super Bowl XXX own. The Green Bay Packers facing the New England Patriots. And at the center of the lights was Brett Favre, the man once considered too reckless to survive in the NFL, now standing on the biggest stage on the planet. That game was like a summary of the man himself: powerful throws, instinctive scrambles, and Desmond Howard's 81-yard touchdown run that sent the stadium into a frenzy. When the clock hit 0, and the scoreboard tilted toward the Packers, Favre leaped up in a shower of green and gold confetti. He hugged the Lombardi Trophy like he was hugging his Mississippi childhood, the years of doubt in Atlanta, the dark nights in rehab. That was the moment all of America believed the story was complete. The hero had won. The man who never left the field had reached the ultimate glory. The image of Favre beaming, helmet in hand, became the symbol of comeback. But when night fell, and the cheers faded into the distance, something else began to emerge. Quiet hotel, long hallway, room lit only by dim light. Favre lay on the bed, the trophy already taken away for photos, teammates sunk into exhausted sleep. He should have been sleeping, should have felt whole, but he couldn't sleep. Shoulder still hurt, neck still stiff, head still throbbed from the hits in the game. His body didn't know he'd just won a championship. His body only knew it had been hit one more time. And his mind, even after touching the peak, still hadn't found peace. There was a very quiet fear that had followed him for years, the fear of not being good enough. Not good enough to keep the job, not good enough to hold on to the spotlight, not good enough to prove the doubters wrong. The trophy didn't erase that fear, it only silenced it temporarily. In that hotel room, in the night after the greatest win of his life, Brett Favre wasn't thinking about legacy, he was thinking about tomorrow, about next season, about whether he could do it again. Success, it turned out, wasn't the end of pressure, it was the beginning of new pressure. In the years that followed, he won 2 more consecutive MVP awards, becoming the first quarterback in NFL history to win 3 straight MVPs from 1995 to 1997. The world called it a dynasty, but for Favre, every season felt like another test. The higher you climb, the more you fear the fall. There were mornings after the Super Bowl when he woke up wondering, is this the only peak I'll ever have? And if it was, what would he do next? For a man taught that his worth lay in getting up and playing, having nothing left to conquer was sometimes scarier than failure. The night he raised the Lombardi Trophy was the public peak, but inside, the small cracks were still there. Physical pain doesn't vanish just because you won. The fear of being replaced doesn't disappear just because you proved yourself. And the memories of the years being dismissed still lurked somewhere, reminding him that everything could be taken away at any moment. Success doesn't heal fear, it just makes fear more sophisticated. When the plane brought the Packers back to Wisconsin, and tens of thousands of fans stood in the February cold to welcome their heroes, Favre smiled, waved, hugged teammates. He was the symbol of strength, of durability, of working-class America that never quits. But deep down, he was still the boy in Kiln, still hearing his father's voice in his head, be tougher. That night he had won the Super Bowl, he had reached the summit millions of players dream of their whole lives. But the real battle, the battle with pain, with fear, with self-doubt, hadn't ended. And amid the brilliant light of glory, a quiet truth existed: medals don't make the body hurt less, titles don't make the mind less restless. And even when the whole world calls you champion, you can still lie awake at night wondering if you're really good enough. After the Super Bowl night, many believed Brett Favre had entered the safe phase of his career, but the truth was the opposite. From 1995 to 1997, he won 3 consecutive MVP titles, a rare feat in NFL history. Brett Favre became the center of the league. He didn't just win, he dominated. But domination always comes with a price. The more he stood out, the more he became a target. Every team came onto the field with a clear plan: hit the quarterback, make him fall, make him slow down, make him afraid. But Favre never learned how to be afraid, he learned how to get up. And so he kept getting up, time after time. In those 3 MVP seasons, he was sacked hundreds of times. Each sack wasn't just lost yards, it was a body over 200 pounds crashing onto his shoulder, his back, his knees. It was the helmet rattling after impact. It was the moment his vision went black for a few brief seconds. There were games when his thumb swelled, so much he could barely grip the ball fully. There was a time he threw with a broken finger, white tape wrapped tight under the glove. His right shoulder, the throwing arm, began developing small tears in the muscle and tendons. Every deep ball sent a sharp stab of pain, but he kept going. Because MVP doesn't allow rest. Because heroes aren't allowed to slow down. In those years, concussions weren't talked about as much as they are today. They called it getting dinged. If you could see straight, if you could remember your name, you could go back in. And Favre usually did. He once said he'd taken so many hits he couldn't count them all. But he didn't count. He played. Green Bay loved that. The NFL loved that. All of America loved the image of the man knocked down and bouncing back like nothing happened. But physics doesn't care about emotion. Physics only records force. Every collision is an equation, force times mass. And the brain, even protected by a thick helmet, is still soft tissue in a hard bone box. No one is immortal against physics. In those seasons, Favre often walked into the locker room with a mud-caked jersey, body bruised purple, arm nearly numb. He smiled at teammates. He joked with reporters. But when the door closed and no cameras were pointed at him, he had to sit quietly for a few minutes, waiting for the dizziness to pass. There were nights he couldn't sleep because his shoulder throbbed, mornings when his neck locked up like it was bolted shut. But the streak of starts kept going. He had built his image on relentless durability, and now, that very image had become an invisible cage. How could the man who never left the field ask for a break? 3 consecutive MVP titles put him in the ranks of legends. The stats kept climbing. Touchdowns increased. Passing yards increased. But along with that, the number of hits also increased. The NFL of the 90s wasn't gentle with quarterbacks the way it is today. Blindside hits could spin the whole body around. Blitzes came without warning. Favre accepted it all as part of the job. He once said he liked the feeling of getting hit and then getting back up. It reminded him he was still alive, but the body doesn't always agree with the mind. The small tears in his shoulder didn't heal on their own. The shakes in his head didn't erase themselves. They accumulated, quietly, patiently. Amid the stadium lights and the roaring cheers, a question began to form, not in the fans' heads but in his body. How much is too much? How many hits can you take before something changes forever? Favre didn't stop to answer. He kept throwing, kept running, kept slapping his helmet after every touchdown. And every time he did, he added another layer to his legend. But at the same time he was also adding another line to the invisible ledger of time. The years from 1995 to 1997 were his most brilliant period. 3 MVPs, 1 Super Bowl. A resurrected team. But if you look closely at the photos from that time, you'll see something else, thicker layers of tape each year. Longer shoulder stretches before games. The very slight wince when turning his head too quickly. The legend was growing, and the body was starting to pay the price. No one said it back then. No one wanted to break the beautiful story of the invincible man in Lambeau's white snow. But physics doesn't care about legends. And while Brett Favre kept building his legacy, gravity, inertia, and impact kept working silently. No one is immortal against physics. And one day the bill comes due. Physics doesn't care about legends. But sometimes fate doesn't care about timing either. In December of 2003, in the middle of a tense season, the phone rang. On the other end was news no son is ever ready to hear. Irvin Favre, the strict father, the first coach, the man who taught him to get up after every fall, had died suddenly from a heart attack. Brett Favre was 34 then. An MVP, a Super Bowl champion, an NFL icon. But in that moment, he was just a son who had lost his father. The Monday Night Football game against the Oakland Raiders was already scheduled. The whole country would be watching. TV lights, cameras, pressure, and now grief. No one would have blamed him if he chose not to play. No one would have questioned if he said he needed time. But Brett Favre had never been taught how to step back. His whole life he'd heard one thing. If you can still stand, you have to play. And so he stepped onto the field. When he ran out of the tunnel, the stands were no longer just a stadium. They became a place of memorial. Teammates hugged him. Opponents patted his shoulder. The whole league knew what had happened. But when the ball was placed down and the opening whistle blew, it was just the game again. And then the inexplicable happened. Favre threw like every pass was a farewell. He completed one throw after another, long balls accurate to an almost surreal degree. The first half ended with 3 touchdowns. In total, he threw 4 touchdowns in that game. 399 yards, one of the greatest performances of his career. Commentators called it a miracle. Analysts called it iron will. The whole country stood up, but what they saw was only the surface. They saw a man turning pain into fuel. They didn't see what was breaking inside. Every time he looked up at the Oakland night sky, maybe he was searching for something more than a win. Maybe he was telling his father, "I'm still standing here." Maybe he was trying to prove that all those years of strictness, all those brutal practices, all those times he was forced to get up, weren't for nothing. When the game ended and teammates surrounded him, Favre finally couldn't hold the calm face anymore. He cried. Not like an MVP, not like a hero, but like a son who had just lost the man who shaped his entire life. That was the public climax. All of America was moved. They called it one of the greatest nights in NFL history. They replayed those plays for years. But when the cameras turned off and the locker room emptied, all that was left was silence. And in that silence, another truth emerged. He hadn't gotten to say goodbye, hadn't had the conversation he should have had. The relationship between Brett and his father was never full of words. Irvin wasn't the kind of man to easily say, "I'm proud of you." He showed love through discipline, through high demands, through never letting his son think he'd done enough. And now, the chance to say the unfinished things was gone. In the days that followed, when people talked about the legendary performance, Favre had to face another feeling, a quiet guilt. He wondered if he should have been with family instead of on the field. If playing was really what his father wanted, or just what he thought his father wanted. People often praise that night as proof of mental strength. But few talk about the psychological cost of suppressing grief to perform. When you turn loss into a performance, you can make the whole world admire you. But you can also delay your own grieving process. After the lights and the applause, Brett Favre went back to the hotel, then home, and had to face the reality that his father would never sit in the stands again. There would be no more stern eyes watching every throw, no more vivid memory of the practice whistle. And in that absence, he realized something more painful than any sack. Sometimes you can play perfectly and still feel like you've lost. That Monday night became etched in NFL history. But for Brett Favre, it wasn't just a game. It was the moment he understood that strength doesn't stop loss, that will doesn't stop death, and that some battles can't be won by getting up and throwing one more time. People remember the 4 touchdowns. They remember the tears on the field. But inside him, something had changed forever. The man taught never to be weak, now had to carry a pain no throw could push away. That night, he played for his father. But that same night, he began to understand that some voids can't be filled. And amid the brilliant light of history, a son quietly carried the feeling that he hadn't gotten to say goodbye. That Monday night made all of America believe Brett Favre could turn tragedy into triumph. But life doesn't stop at one game. And a few months later, pain knocked on his door in a completely different way, quieter, more cruel, and with no scoreboard to come back from. In 2004, Deanna Favre was diagnosed with breast cancer. No opening whistle. No teammates surrounding him. No stadium lights. Just a hospital room. Cold white lights, and one word that made everything spin: cancer. Brett Favre had faced giant linebackers charging at full speed. He'd been knocked down, sacked, slammed onto concrete hard turf. But he'd never felt as helpless as when the doctor talked about treatment stages, about chemotherapy, about surgery. On the field, he could throw the ball out of danger's reach. In the locker room, he could yell to fire up his teammates. But against cancer, he had no playbook, no strategy, no way to charge in and shield the woman he loved from the pain. For the first time in his life, he understood there are battles you can't fight for someone else. Deanna had stood by him through his darkest years, when he struggled with addiction, when the press doubted, when his career teetered. She didn't love the MVP, she loved the man behind the helmet. And now their roles reversed. He had to be the rock, but that didn't make him any less afraid. There were nights he sat by the hospital bed, watching Deanna sleep after an exhausting day of treatment. No makeup, no camera flashes, just the very real fragility of a body fighting to survive. He held her hand and realized all the hits he'd ever taken hadn't prepared him for this moment. Cancer doesn't care about MVP awards. It doesn't care about the streak of 297 consecutive games. It doesn't care about Super Bowl XXXV. It just advances, quietly and coldly. Favre once said he'd never been afraid of getting hit on the field. But he was afraid of this. Afraid of waking up one morning to bad news. Afraid of imagining a future without the woman who'd walked through every storm with him. Afraid of explaining to their kids why their mom was getting weaker day by day. There were games in the 2004 season when he stepped onto the field with a heavy heart. Not because of win or lose pressure, but because in his mind there was only the image of that hospital room. He played, threw, cheered with teammates, but his mind was somewhere else. For the first time, football was no longer the center of the universe. Before, when things got tough, he'd dive into the field as a way to escape emotions. But now he couldn't run. He had to sit, listen, wait for test results. Wait for his wife's body to respond to chemo. Wait for hope. That waiting was harsher than any overtime. They say sports teach you how to fight, but cancer teaches you to accept that not every battle is within your control. Favre had to learn to let go of the illusion that he could fix everything with sheer will. He could be there. He could hold her hand. He could pray. But he couldn't throw a pass to beat the disease. And it was in that helplessness that he began to change. He understood that strength isn't just enduring hits. It's sitting beside the person you love in their weakest moments without looking away. It's admitting you're scared but staying anyway. When Deanna gradually recovered after treatment, when positive results started coming in, Favre felt a different kind of gratitude. Not loud like Super Bowl night, not dazzling like 3 MVPs. Just a deep relief when he saw his wife smile without forcing it. Cancer entered their home like a storm, and though they ultimately got through it, it left an indelible mark. It reminded Favre that the human body is more fragile than he'd ever thought, that fame doesn't shield you from illness, and that some battles make you understand your own limits. After it all, Brett Favre kept playing. He kept throwing, kept getting sacked, kept getting up. But deep down he knew something new and painful. He couldn't fight everything. And maybe that realization was the real turning point for the man who'd once believed he could conquer anything by never leaving the field. After cancer left their home, life didn't go back to the way it was. It became more precious, more fragile. And strangely, while Brett Favre understood the limits of the human body more deeply, he went on doing the exact opposite to his own. His streak of consecutive starts never broke. 200, 220, 250, 270. With each number climbing, the legend grew bigger. Finally it stopped at 297 games, a record many believe will never be broken. Brett Favre became the icon of absolute durability, the man who never missed a snap. But numbers don't tell the whole story. There were games he played with a broken finger, white tape wrapped tight under the glove, games when his right shoulder had torn muscle, every deep ball feeling like it pulled another nerve to the breaking point, games when he was slammed onto frozen turf, lying still a few seconds longer than usual, then still getting up. The streak of 297 games wasn't just presence, it was endurance. The NFL in the 90s and 2000s didn't protect quarterbacks the way it does now. Head hits weren't instantly penalized. Blindside collisions weren't slowed down on replay to check for concussion risk. When his head rattled after a hard sack, the question was rarely "How's your brain?" but "Can you keep going?" And Favre's answer was almost always the same: yes. No one wanted to be the one to break the streak. No one wanted to walk into the locker room and tell teammates they needed a break. For someone raised in a culture where pain isn't spoken, Admitting a concussion was almost the same as admitting weakness, and he wasn't taught to be weak. There were times he saw little spots of light in his vision after a hit, times his head spun, but he shook it lightly, took a deep breath, and got back into the huddle. The crowd stood up when he returned to the field. They loved that image. They loved the defiance. The public loved the durability. They loved the story of the man who never missed a game. They loved the numbers. They loved the way he smiled after every hit. But no one asked how his brain was. No one sat with him on the nights his head throbbed after games. No one saw the moments when it took him a few seconds to recall a play that had just happened. Throughout that streak, his body became a battlefield. His right shoulder, the throwing arm, wore down season after season. Knees swelled after every practice. His back stiffened like a board every morning. But he kept going. Because the legend had been built, and the legend demanded to be maintained. There is a cruel truth in professional sports. You're loved for what you endure. Every time Favre got up after a heavy tackle, the stands erupted. Every time he threw a touchdown with his shoulder taped thick, the story of the Iron Man got reinforced. But steel has its breaking point too. Physics doesn't forget. Every collision sent a small vibration through the skull. The brain, even protected by a helmet, is still soft tissue. It banged against the inside of the bone, over and over, hundreds of times, maybe thousands. And through all those years no one talked much about CTE. No one gave clear warnings. Favre only knew one thing. The team needed him. The city needed him. And he needed himself to keep going. The streak of 297 games became a symbol of will, but it also became a symbol of silence. Silence about the lingering headaches. Silence about the moments of mental fatigue. Silence about the times his body begged for rest. Maybe deep down he understood that every extra game was another debt. But when you're in the middle of tens of thousands cheering, when you feel the adrenaline pumping through your veins, it's hard to think about the distant future. Hard to imagine a day when you'd sit in a quiet room trying to remember a game that memory had started to blur. The public saw a number, 297. But behind that number were 297 times the body was put in danger, 297 weeks of recovery, 297 times getting up instead of resting, and countless collisions no one counted. When that streak finally ended in 2010, many felt sad that a record had stopped. But maybe on some level, it was also a release. No more pressure to keep the number intact. No more fear of being the one to break his own legend. But the price had already been paid. And in the years that followed, as studies on concussions in the NFL spread, as stories about CTE appeared more and more, the questions started coming back, this time not from the fans, but from him. How many of those hits are still there? The streak of 297 games was once seen as proof of immortality. But time has its own way of testing legends, and when the stadium lights go out, when the cheers no longer drown out thought, all that's left is a quiet truth. The public loves durability, but the brain doesn't care about admiration, and no one, no matter how tough, can beat physics forever. The streak of 297 games ended, but Brett Favre's story didn't stop. And perhaps the most painful thing in his career didn't come from a sack, but from the goodbye. In 2008, after many tense seasons, he announced his retirement from the Green Bay Packers. America seemed ready for a perfect ending. Tribute videos, emotional articles, a legend walking off into the sunset, leaving Lambeau Field as a cathedral bearing his mark. But things weren't that simple. Favre wasn't sure he was ready to leave the game. Football wasn't just a job, it was his heartbeat, the familiar noise that filled the inner voids. When you've lived more than 15 years with Sunday roars, silence can become terrifying. Just a few months after announcing retirement, he started thinking about coming back. He said he missed the grass, missed the feeling of competition. But while he hesitated, the Packers moved on. Aaron Rodgers was chosen to take over. The team couldn't wait forever. And so the conflict began. Favre wanted to return. The Packers no longer wanted to build their future around him. Closed-door meetings, vague statements, hurt feelings. For a man who'd given his body for years, feeling pushed aside wasn't easy to accept. Green Bay's hero was now looked at differently. When he was traded to the New York Jets, many Packers fans felt betrayed, but what cut deeper was the decision that followed. In 2009, Favre signed with the Minnesota Vikings, Green Bay's archrival. In Wisconsin, that was almost unforgivable. When he returned to Lambeau in a Vikings uniform, boos rang out instead of cheers. The man once revered as the city's symbol was now seen as a traitor. Signs that once bore his name were torn down. Number 4 jerseys were put away. That feeling hurt worse than any tackle. Favre had never played to please everyone, but he'd never imagined he'd be booed in the place that once called him its son. When he stood under the Lambeau lights, hearing whistles from the stands, maybe a different memory flashed through his mind. The early years when Green Bay gave him a second chance. His legacy began to be debated. Did he have the right to keep playing if he still could? Or did he owe the Packers a cleaner ending? People argued on TV, in the papers, on every forum, but few asked how he felt having to choose between loyalty and the desire to keep playing. With the Vikings, he had one of the best seasons of his career at age 40. That made the story even more complicated. The old hero had become a real threat, and when he threw a touchdown against his former team, the joy of victory mixed with an unnamed sorrow. Brett Favre never wanted to be the villain, but professional sports doesn't always write simple scripts. Hero and villain are sometimes separated only by a contract, and perhaps what made everything more painful was the realization that a legend doesn't protect you from the changes of time. The Packers had to think about the future, Rodgers had to have his chance, and Favre, no matter how great, couldn't stay forever. Looking back, people can see this as an inevitable chapter, but at the time, it felt like a crack in a bronze statue, a reminder that the fans' love can shift as quickly as a pass. The hero was booed, the legacy was debated, and amid it all, Brett Favre remained the man who'd been taught never to leave the field. He kept playing, kept getting up, kept throwing, even when the cheers had turned to doubt. But for the first time, he understood that some battles aren't about the score. They're about how history will remember you, and how you look back at yourself when the lights go out. The hero was booed, the legacy was debated, but Brett Favre had never been the type to stop because of the noise. In 2009, in a Minnesota Vikings uniform, he stepped into his age 40 season with something to prove, not to Green Bay, not to the media, but to himself, that he was still there, that his arm could still tear through defenses, that all those years of enduring hadn't taken away his instinct. And then something strange happened. The 2009 season didn't feel like a fading final chapter. It felt like a resurrection. Favre threw with astonishing accuracy. He moved in the pocket with the calm of someone who'd seen every blitz imaginable. 33 touchdowns, only 7 interceptions in the regular season, the highest passer rating of his career, at age 40. The doubters had to go quiet. Minnesota believed they could reach the Super Bowl. The Metrodome shook every Sunday. Favre, once seen as a villain in Green Bay, was now celebrated as a savior in Minnesota. Sports always has a way of rewriting the story. And then came the NFC Championship against the New Orleans Saints. A game stretched tight as a wire. Heavy hits. The Saints' defense kept coming at him. Late hits. Shoves near the sideline. A 40-year-old body no longer absorbed impacts like it did at 25. But he still got up, still shook his head, still stepped into the huddle like nothing happened. The game went down to the final minutes. Tied score. The Vikings needed just a few more yards for field goal range. One kick could send them to the Super Bowl. One moment could silence all the debates about his legacy. And then in a split second everything changed. Favre dropped back, looked right, saw a thin window. He threw toward the sideline, but the ball sailed a bit high, a bit slow, and a Saints defender cut in front. Interception. The stadium went silent. In that moment, millions of Americans let out a collective sigh, not because they hated him, but because they knew they'd just witnessed a turning point. The Saints scored in overtime and earned their trip to the Super Bowl. The Vikings stopped at the doorstep. Favre stood on the field, helmet still on, eyes unable to hide the emptiness. He'd thrown hundreds of risky passes in his career. Many became legendary. But this one was different. It wasn't just a play. It was a question mark. Had he played 1 year too many? That question didn't just come from the media. It came from his body, from the hits in that game, from the aching neck, from the swollen ankle after every scramble, from the arm that had thrown thousands of passes over 2 decades. Maybe if he hadn't tried so hard, maybe if he'd accepted running instead of throwing, maybe if he'd stopped in Green Bay. But sports doesn't live on maybe, it lives on moments, and in that moment Favre did what he'd always done, trusted his arm. The fateful interception became a haunting image, not because it erased a brilliant season, but because it evoked the fragility of time. He'd proven he was still great at 40, but he'd also proven that even the man who never left the field couldn't control every ending. When he walked off the field that night, he wasn't booed like at Lambeau, he was hugged by teammates. But inside maybe he understood that a chance like that wouldn't come again. The 2009 season was a beautiful climax, but it was also like a sunset, most brilliant right before the darkness falls. And as Brett Favre entered 2010 with a body that had taken too many hits, that question lingered, quiet and persistent: had he played 1 year too many? That fateful interception didn't end his career right away, but it opened a door Brett Favre couldn't close forever. His body entered the 2010 season like a machine that had run too long. Injured ankle, shoulder no longer as fluid, hits now left longer echoes. And then the streak of 297 consecutive games, the symbol of immortality, also came to an end. In 2011, he retired. This time no hesitation, no comeback, no closed-door meetings or vague statements. Just a quiet acknowledgement that his body had reached its limit. When you've lived 2 decades with Sunday roars, silence can be scarier than any opponent. Brett Favre returned to Mississippi, back to the red dirt roads where it all began. Back to a slower rhythm, where afternoons end in sunset and crickets sing in the dark fields. No more announcers calling his name. No more stadiums shaking when he emerged from the tunnel. No more adrenaline pumping before every snap. The man once screamed for by entire stadiums now sat on his porch, listening to the wind through the pines. At first glance, it was a beautiful ending. He had family, a farm, freedom no longer tied to practice schedules. But what few talked about was the emptiness that appeared after the noise vanished. Football wasn't just a job, it was the structure of his life. Every week had a goal, every season had a challenge, every throw was a test. When you've lived in that rhythm for 20 years, waking up without a playbook, without a training plan, can leave you feeling lost. There were mornings he woke up and for the first few seconds thought he still had to prepare for Sunday's game. Then he remembered there were no more games, no more huddle, no more snap count. Adrenaline had once been his fuel. It let him forget pain, forget fatigue. But when there was no reason for his body to release that chemical anymore, he had to learn to live slower, learn to accept a normal heartbeat, learn to let days pass without a scoreboard to measure his worth. In Mississippi, life was so peaceful it felt almost surreal for a man who'd once lived under national TV lights. The crickets chirping at night rang clearer than the roars that once shook Lambeau Field, and in that quiet, thoughts started to speak louder. He thought about the years gone by, about the reckless throws, about the hits to the head, about the streak of 297 games, about his father, about Deanna in the hospital room, about the decisions that made him a hero in one place and a villain in another. Retirement wasn't just leaving the field, it was facing himself without the armor of titles. No more MVP label to shield him, no more teammates to share the load, just Brett Favre the man. There were days he felt at peace. He hunted, he talked with old friends, he joined charity events. But there were also days he missed the collisions, missed stepping into the huddle, missed the moment the ball left his hand and soared through freezing air. Professional sports doesn't teach you how to stop, it teaches you how to keep going. So learning to accept an ending became another challenge. The man once screamed for by entire stadiums now sat in the middle of a Mississippi night, listening to crickets, and realizing the world kept turning without him needing to throw one more pass. That wasn't tragedy, but it was truth. And in that truth, there was an emptiness he had to learn to fill with something else: family, faith, quiet mornings. but nothing could fully replace the roar of tens of thousands. After the cheers faded, after the lights went out, Brett Favre stepped into a new chapter of his life. No longer the man who never left the field, but the man who had to learn to live without a stadium, and in the quiet of Mississippi, amid dark fields and the steady hum of insects, he began to face the question he'd never had time to hear clearly before. In the quiet of Mississippi, when crickets replaced the cheers, when mornings no longer had practice schedules, Brett Favre started noticing the small things he'd never had time for before. Not the scars on his shoulder, not the stiff knees when the weather turned cold, but the very brief gaps in his memory. At first they seemed harmless. He'd walk into a room and forget what he came for. He'd tell a story and pause midway because he couldn't recall the next detail. He'd try to remember a specific game, a crucial throw, and realize the memory faded faster than he'd expected. Brett Favre once had a memory sharp enough to read a defense in seconds. He could diagnose a blitz in a blink. Now he had to pause to find a simple word. No one saw it except his family. No TV cameras captured the moments he went quiet a few seconds longer than usual. But in that quiet house, he started wondering, was this just age, or was it something else? In the years after retirement, the NFL began facing the truth about concussions. Studies on CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, appeared more and more. Former players shared stories of memory loss, depression, personality changes. The brain isn't a muscle. It doesn't recover like a shoulder or a knee. It records every shake. And Favre started thinking about the hits. Hundreds of sacks, hundreds of times his head hit the turf, the times he got dinged, and just shook it off to get back in. In an interview years later, he admitted he was concerned. He said that if he'd known more about the neurological risks when he was younger, he might have thought differently. If I had known. That phrase wasn't full regret, but it was an admission. This was what many had suspected for years. Not scandal, not money, not team controversies, but the neurological price. The public loved his durability. They loved the streak of 297 games. They loved the image of the man knocked down and getting back up. But no one asked how his brain was. No one questioned the accumulated concussions over 2 decades. Now when he sat in front of cameras, his voice slowed a little, his eyes deeper. He didn't speak with bitterness. He spoke with honesty. He admitted he'd taken so many hits he couldn't count them. He admitted there were games he didn't remember clearly. He admitted there were days he worried about his own future. Mortality didn't come to him through one tackle. It came through tiny moments. A forgotten name. A repeated story. A memory no longer as sharp as before. And in that facing, there was a very quiet sadness. He didn't blame the game. He didn't turn his back on football. He still loved it. But he also stopped pretending everything was fine. The truth no longer lived in stats. It lived in the mornings he had to focus harder to recall something that once came naturally. If I had known. That phrase echoed like a reminder for the next generation. Not to stop them from playing, but to make them understand the price more clearly. Favre wasn't a victim. He chose to keep playing. But that choice was made in an era that didn't fully understand the neurological consequences of repeated impacts. This was the truth we suspected when we watched him get hit hundreds of times and still smile. This was the question we sometimes asked, but rarely voiced. What happens when the lights go out, and all that's left is a brain that's taken too many shakes? No one is immortal against physics, and no one is immune to time. Brett Favre didn't talk about this with drama. He didn't turn it into tragedy, but that very calmness made it heavier. He knew he'd given so much. He knew he'd built a great legacy. But he also knew that the body, and especially the brain, has its own way of keeping score. In the quiet house in Mississippi, when crickets sang again every night, he no longer heard the roars of Lambeau or the Metrodome. He heard his own heartbeat, and sometimes he wondered if those old hits had left something longer lasting than he'd ever imagined. This wasn't a collapse, not a sudden end. It was a slow realization, a straight look in the mirror, and an admission that even legends have limits. And perhaps for the first time in his life, Brett Favre didn't try to get up and keep going like nothing happened. He sat still, reflected, and admitted what many had suspected for years. The price of sports immortality is sometimes paid with the mind, quietly, silently, but undeniably. In the quiet house in Mississippi, where afternoons end in long sunsets across the fields, Brett Favre no longer heard the clash of helmets. He heard the wind, the footsteps of grandchildren running on the porch, the laughter of the woman who'd walked through his darkest years with him. And in those simple sounds, he began to understand his legacy more clearly. Brett Favre was once known as the man who never left the field, but before he was an NFL legend, he was a husband who nearly lost his family to addiction, and chose to face it instead of running. He was a father who tried to teach his daughter what his own father taught him: be tough, but this time with one more thing: speak up when it hurts. He wasn't perfect, he was reckless, made wrong decisions, made fans love him and then hurt them when he switched to a rival. He played one more year when maybe he should have stopped. He threw risky passes that cost his teams, but he also gave everything. 20 years in the NFL wasn't just numbers. It was 20 years of a body pushed to the edge of its limits, 20 years of getting up after every collision, 20 years of carrying the pressure of a city, then a league, then an entire generation of quarterbacks compared to him. Some players leave when their body starts crying for help. Favre stayed longer than was safe. Some choose preservation. He chose competition. Some hold back a piece of strength for the future. He spent it all in the present. When he was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2016, the lights shone on his name once more. But that speech wasn't about immortality. It was about the journey, about the mistakes, about the people who helped him get back up. He didn't speak like a perfect man. He spoke like someone who'd lived fully, both the glory and the damage. That Southern man didn't grow up with lessons about fragility. He grew up with lessons about endurance. But time taught him one more thing: enduring isn't always winning. Sometimes winning is admitting limits. When talking about neurological concerns, he didn't blame anyone. He didn't build a tragic image. He just admitted the price exists. And that admission, in a sports world where people often hide weakness, is another form of courage. As a husband, he stayed when his wife fought breast cancer. As a father, he learned to listen instead of just demand. As a man who'd battled addiction, he walked into rehab and said he needed help. Those things don't show up on the scoreboard, but they are victories too. Brett Favre's legacy isn't just the streak of 297 consecutive games. It isn't just 3 MVP awards. It isn't just the Lombardi Trophy. It lies in the truth that he lived the way he believed, daring to risk, daring to get up, daring to keep going. And then when the time came, daring to face the price. He wasn't immortal. Time caught up to him. His body hit its limit. Memories sometimes aren't as sharp as before, but what hasn't changed is how he looks back on his path. Not with bitter regret, but with the understanding that every choice has consequences. If I had known, maybe he would have changed a few things. Maybe he would have listened to his body sooner. Maybe he wouldn't have tried so hard to keep a legend alive forever. But if you asked him if he'd play again, the answer would probably still be yes. Because football didn't just take, it gave him purpose, gave him community, gave him the chance to become the strongest version of himself. On a Mississippi afternoon, when the late-day sun spreads across the porch, Brett Favre is no longer the quarterback of the Packers or the Vikings. He's just a man looking back at his life and seeing it full, both light and shadow. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't immortal, but he gave everything. And perhaps that's the truest definition of a sports legend, not that they never fall, but that they're willing to pay the price for every time they stand back up. Helmets can crack, bones can heal, records can be broken, but the price, sometimes it stays inside. The story of Brett Favre leaves me with a feeling that's both proud and aching. We cheered for the streak of 297 consecutive games as an American symbol, the spirit that doesn't quit, doesn't leave the field, doesn't surrender. But when you look at the specific details, the repeated sacks, the times he got dinged and went right back in, the nights he couldn't sleep after Super Bowl XXX, or the moment he admitted, "If I had known," you realize that behind the legend was a man who gave his entire body. I feel sorrow when I remember that Monday night in 2003, he threw 4 touchdowns the night his father died. All of America praised that strength, but few thought about the guilt of a son who didn't get to say goodbye. I'm moved when I recall 1996, when he walked into rehab at the peak of his career. That wasn't weakness, that was courage. I feel it deeply when I think about 2004, when Deanna fought cancer, and he realized for the first time he couldn't control everything with sheer will. And I go quiet when I read about the memory gaps after retirement, the neurological price the public never asked about. The lesson for America isn't don't play, don't dream big, don't compete. The lesson is celebrate durability, but also respect human limits. Teach our sons not just to get up after a hit, but to say I'm hurting when they are. Real strength isn't just in never leaving the field, it's in knowing when to protect yourself and the people you love. If the story of the man who gave his entire body to this game makes you think, please hit subscribe so we can keep exploring the journeys behind the spotlight of sports. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll once again listen to stories of glory, cost, and the true strength of being human.